Hi all, today we talk about the Great Famine of 1315-17 and more in general about the 14th century crisis of European society. I think this is a very important topic that I always personally gave a um, great relevance to in general, even if I'm not a great expert about it. And the more I learn about it, I realize how the beginning of the 14th century is such an important moment in European history, and how the plague of 1348 that eventually extended all over Europe and coming cyclically again for other 4 centuries was actually, a consequence, or at least it is interpretable in part as a great consequence of a previous crisis that had occurred into European society in the first half of the 14th century. So this idea of the 14th century of a breaking point in medieval history is definitely something historians tend to agree on. Essentially, the greater perception of the Middle Ages is the reprisal started from the 11th century and lasted until the 13th, that were these centuries of relative happiness, let's say, in European history in many ways, because in spite of the general harshness of the life of those times compared to ours, of course, um, this period saw a very substantial increasing, not just of the number of population, but also of its quality of life. The mortality had substantially decreased during these centuries. There were new centers, new endemic centers on the rise, especially cities that had remained asleep, let's say, in large parts of Europe since the end of the Roman Empire. Um, and was a great expansion that we can measure even archaeologically speaking. Think, for instance, about all the city walls that are being built at this time that show us pretty well how these original cores that had remained habitated within the city walls during the early Middle Ages from the ancient world basically began to expand once again at a point needing even larger rings essentially to expand in. And in all this, obviously, there was also a huge increase in trade traffics, not just from a quantitative point of view, but also from a qualitative point of view. And today, we generally consider that this in these 3 centuries before the Black Death, there was a sort of positive and progressive process that is generally perceived as such. This is very debatable in some ways because, and not just because, obviously we can relate to our times by saying those were essentially harsh times anyway, but because effectively there was a kind of expansion that wasn't really directed from the above, that saw also an increase in conflictuality of certain problems in terms of production and setup, certain elements of society that within society that were even factors of risks, if we want. There are very strict economical metaphors that can fit in this sense with the crisis of 14th century. It's as if there was a crisis of overproduction, but we'll arrive to that in a short while. And generally speaking, in historiography has often explained the rise of low medieval Europe through through a climate change, and obviously um, a climate warming that had created certain environmental conditions for which the Europeans, and not just them, could restart to grow in a certain sense. From and this is when we talk about topics like this about climate changing in explaining um, certain historical events, it's always a risky card in many ways. I personally am not a great fan of the explanation. There are many hypotheses at this point, and probably I believe in climate changing affecting substantially these processes. But at the same time, there were also other factors involved. It might sound banal, but climate warming, okay, but couldn't it be that Europeans at that point just, pushed to expand for in some way simply because they had the space for? These are things that are being rediscussed very much nowadays because uh, of the same actually reasons for which this concept came into historiography. Climate changing is something that historiographically speaking we started to consider um, from a time when we as moderns start to study and knowing better climate changings and worrying about them. And I can't say it followed a sort of fashion, but obviously there were certain extremes that are mitigated, sometimes also by the opposite extremes. So this is for saying that I don't own any particular ideological sympathy for both sides, but I really wanted to see clear in the world matter. But objectively, from the reprisal of European economy, telling the truth is something that dates a couple of centuries before the 11th. The 8th century seemingly was a moment of growth. Then there is the fall of the Carolingian Empire. Certain things started happening. It seems the 10th century is sort of dark century again compared to what had happened previously. But seemingly from certain studies we know that from the second half of the 10th century the polar ices began to melt again, and that this perhaps made feasible, and it's always very theoretical, very hypothetical in many ways, in historical terms, that this even allowed the Vikings to expand towards Iceland, Greenland, and North America, and other other hints and evidences that kind of suggest this having happened. For instance, the line of cultivation of grapes, of vineyards, basically rose in latitude, becoming to surpass the latitude of London. You know that grapes are extremely important in ancient and in the ancient medieval world to understand much about the civilization expansion capabilities, because they are related to mostly environmental factors that for the technology of the time were determining how much a civilization would spread far. For instance, the Romans expanded into those areas where grapes could be cultivated. And this for other technological reasons that I can't explain to you right now, but let's say that there are evidences that around the 11th century onwards, there is this general global warming, because this isn't happening just in Europe. This happens also in parts of Asia, and we're pretty confident, at least for the sources that we have, that this was an objective fact overall. Then how much it interfered with the growth of European societies, this could be more debatable, but it surely was a factor at this point, and I think we can say, be safe in assessing something like that. And at the same time, we're also other events like, for instance, there was scarce rain at a point, um, that however were regular in time, so they kind of fit in a cycle that favored um, um, the agrarian production, as well as warm springs that obviously were very important for the harvests, and seemingly conferred a general surplus to European society that was invested in further expansion. So the when we talk about the plague of 1348 as this mm, cataclysmic event that stopped apparently the growth of a European society that up to the 14th century had overinflated in many ways. It was a huge society, even numerically, demographically speaking. Europe had reached a huge expansion that could be recovered after the Black Death, just for some regions, even only during the modern age. So you can understand the dimension and the seriousness of this disaster and how it affected world European history. But what is being noticed, not just in Europe but also for other areas in the world, is that the Black Death of 1348 actually came at the end of a period of general crisis um, that that pushed historians to argue that essentially it wasn't the Black Death wasn't much of a of how do you say that of a triggering factor uh, in um, uh, in the decline of 14th century Europe, but if anything, a consequence, or at least something that perfectly um, rooted into a society that was already sick in many ways. And we generally talk about the crisis of the 14th century, in fact, even before the Black Death, and this is what we're going to discuss today. And we can argue that the crisis was start to be perceived already from the second half of the 13th century, so even a century before the Black Death. And everything is supported as a theory by the fact that there was a very unfavorable balance in early 14th century Europe between the growth of the population and that one of the production. And this was a very serious problem for the simple fact that the great growth and rebirth occurred from the 11th century had been, considering the technology of the time, much more a quantitative phenomenon than a strictly qualitative one. Even though we have seen how um, Western civilization actually rose also in substantially in quality in a certain sense, but especially in agricultural methods and you know um, crops growing technologies, etc. There hadn't really been during these centuries a real substantial advancement or something that could really the revolutionate the production system of that time, which there wasn't even the potential for doing something like that objectively. So what had remained was this huge demographical um, increasement that had occurred, and that had brought Europe really to become very densely populated compared to the previous centuries. And what happened, like with crisis well, telling the truth, a bit different from an overproduction crisis, but something, however, similar in certain verses, is that when the first wrong things started occurring into the production system, this one wasn't capable of supporting anymore the huge amount of population that Europe had at the time. So what is interesting to think about is that by the end of the 13th century, there had even been a physical limit to the expansion um, um, of the arable land in on the European continent, because basically all that could be plugged essentially it had been plugged indeed, and at a certain point the increase of the population started over exceeding the capacities, the structural capacities of support of these population. And however, the population kept growing, so it was unavoidable that certain phenomena would occur. Obviously, it wasn't a big crack. Um, Even though today we're talking about this Great Famine in 13, 15, 17, there were, even this phenomenon itself, like the major Black Death eventually, was already prepared by other conditions. So the first and most evident condition of the overpopulation of a place with limited resources is that people began to be worse fed. So at least, and this hit especially those parts of the population that had been the most unfavored, and that however had been also the one that had expanded most, so usually the middle and lower classes. So we're talking about um, even essentially day laborers, especially both those in countryside and those in the textile industries that had spread so much into Europe at that time. Those salaries were kept low during these centuries, had been kept low during these centuries because there was an increasing offer of working force directly tied to the demographical increase. So essentially this meant and that at a job level there was a huge competition. There was a very elastic employment organization, at least at certain levels, at least in the ones that in the larger industries. So incidentally also in the ones that supported a greater demand on the market, and that obviously was based on a creaking fundament, because at this point the malnutrition and undernourishment of the population was already producing very very negative consequences. Think, for instance, about the increase of prices. The problems that start occurring in this point. There's an increase of prices because production becomes less, functional, and the first harvests of the years 13, 15, and 17 basically struck on the average peasant and urban worker of that was already very bad nourished in many ways. These people had they were largely, especially gravitating around the cities because, paradoxically speaking, those peasants uh, and people who had remained living in the country, especially in areas that were heavily forested areas that were mm, more distant from cities, had in many ways probably a better average nutrition than those who instead had gravitated around the cities and had entered into this production system, especially in those areas of Europe in which countries had more been tied to urban economy. So we're talking about people who either, it doesn't matter where they lived in the country or had already left in mass immigration towards the cities, but they had a very bad nutrition. They had been fed already by several generations exclusively with cereals, and their immunitary systems were rather weak, considering that they didn't eat fats or proteins, and therefore had very low physiological defenses to the worsening of the general environmental condition. So the precarity of this balance was, dramatically revealed in the first two decades of the 14th century, when there was seemingly a first coldening of the climate after at least a more substantial and structural one that had not previously existed largely in Europe um, before since many centuries. I'm not saying that obviously there weren't cold years, because if you read in the annals and stuff like that, you find obviously that between the 11th and 14th century there were very cold winters at some time. But they were scarce. Structurally speaking, it could happen every once in a while, but then there was still a surplus that could be used, and we're talking about a very small surplus for our standards. So, if this worsening of climate basically started to happen for 2 or 3 years in a row, well, this relatively prosperous society could very rapidly exhaust all its surplus and eventually go into recession with all the consequences that you can imagine. So the um, um, the polar ices began once again to expand. Rain and humidity began to characterize several years in several consecutive years in European continent, and this caused obviously illnesses and colds that obviously hit first of all the weaker part of the population, that is children and old people. But there was also, and most importantly, the problem of the harvests, which began to essentially go wasted, to fail, to go ruined, and therefore this triggered in turn famines and the levitation of prices. So it was a sort of vicious circle, and that showed all the weakness of this system. So cold and humidity could bring to illness and hunger, and all these determined a destabilization of the socioeconomical um, um, conditions that was obviously very strongly felt in the poorer strata of the population, and that therefore caused to the base of the productive system in turn a very great weakness of the system itself, because it was essentially hitting the same people who had been exploited to produce the wealth uh, upon which Europe at the time was functioning. So this general tendency of the phenomenon wasn't really perceived at the time. Incidentally, I'm studying certain sources exactly from the 14th century, and what you realize is that really in the first 2 decades of the 14th century, people start to say always more often that basically seasons were crazy, that were cold summers and warm winters, that the crops died essentially, um, that was a very poor income, that people became poorer because as a consequence. It was the people probably didn't understand the longer picture, even though I have some doubt about it, because we don't have to think these people to obviously understand this form of cycles, or to have a general picture of what was going on in the whole continent. But obviously if this happens into a city, especially those cities, that one of those cities that is connected economically speaking with the rest of the continent, this is something you're really gonna perceive. In fact, in these sources you find expressions like, there was a high mortality due to a famine in this place when where we are writing, and generally very generally also in the rest of the world. So it's evident that these people kind of understood that something was going on, but then obviously didn't have a clear view of the whole picture. And the Great Famine of the 13th, 15th, and 17 was definitely the first big famine that was felt all over Europe, and that caused a very big disaster. It was a very heavy blow to European economy of this, already sickly system. Basically, this happened as a series of bad harvests followed during several years, and therefore as we've seen, the general levitation of prices, because there was more demand on the market, and those who could not pay for it, so the poorer essentially suffered most of it, and naturally um, these in this pre-industrial society, these poorer people were essentially the ones who were producing that wealth in some measure. So famines that had already existed became, however, to increase hugely in turn, and to create our problem. Also because if you're a peasant and you don't have anything to eat, you can, there are very few options you can take, but the real problem here is the consequences, that if you fail um, to earn your food, you can't even invest for the next year of production. So it's not just about you and someone, growing crops in that place, because you need working force, you need labor force to keep that cycle going on. And the rich could pay for price increases, but they couldn't produce that in turn. They could maybe make it imported. This happened many times. But overall, this can happen for maybe one city or two, but at a regional scale, or even a continental scale, if the whole system collapses, the whole substance, the whole structure obviously falls in some measure. Um, And so when we talk about famines in this period, we don't have, as we were saying, to be surprised because there had always been famines. That was normal as um, as an economical cycle already at that time. This all the Malthusian circle, etc. But um, the real problem of this crisis was that it began to take root into the commercial net. And because, as we were saying, were cities were importing grain from other regions. So this was also a way to keep costs down, to keep prices down, and even mortality, and therefore to save the system in some way. Um, but as we were saying before, the greatest part of Europe was in great uh, difficulty because that could be done somewhere but not everywhere. And and while the negative climate conditions were continuing, so very cold and long winters, some very rainy and summers, especially with great floods and also other events of various kind. Floods really happened also seemingly very much during to an over um, to an extent. There were also hailstorms that obviously caused great damage. Think even about the material culture of the time. If you lived in a hut, a hailstorm could be something pretty serious. Um, so it was really a climate that was hitting hard over this already fragile system. And it's funny that in the sources, funny, well, telling the truth is very sad, but one thing that really helps us, historically speaking, to say that this was an exceptional event, because it's not something you find, so easily trackable, even from sources. Um, what you find is that there are people in these sources essentially claiming that there was no memory of such problems at that time. It means that the older people didn't remember anything like that. And that of the older people was generally the only historical memory that was present, especially within the lower um, strata of the population. So that tells you in practice that it was really something new, it was really something exceptional for the society of the time, for the climate of the time, what was going on. And the as we've seen, there was a strong increase in prices, and especially the one of cereals that, as we've seen, were the base of European diet of the time. And this caused obviously the great problem of people not being able to afford to pay food. There was also great mortality into cattle, especially for denutrition and illnesses that it brought um, alongside with the economic, that happened alongside with the economical crisis, and this brought sometimes to certain communities literally starving to death in a very short amount of time. Here there is the example of Ypres in northeastern France. I don't remember, maybe it's Belgium. I'm sorry about that. That counted at the time around 20-25,000 inhabitants. So it was not a small city for those times. And basically, in 6 months, from May to November 1316, almost 3,000 people died, which means more than 10% of the population. And that tells you how even the urban centers that were the more resourceful one were, however, incapable of coping with the situation. And how, by the way, the agricultural production was, however, still the base of urban centers that didn't live of trade alone. So and this is normal in pre-industrial societies. So this kind of famines, happened again, especially in the mid of the 14th century, as the Black Death began to spread. But this series is interpretable as sort of a long process of destructuration of European economy, since something um, um, since quite some time, that it's just, however, with together with the plague, so in the 40s of the 14th century, that had its greater effects, which is a sort of a circumstance or conjuncture that happened, but that had of various problems, but these problems had already had a root into previous times. So as we were saying, also the cities were affected deeply by this crisis, not just the country, and it hit especially those industries that um, of luxury products, for instance. The textile production had so stagnation, and this caused in turn the stall of the relation between the great golden coins that was used for international trading and the silver coins, or maybe even less precious metal that was the usual currency used for paying the salaries. So what happened is that until the 1320s, the relation between gold and silver had shown a steady growth in the value of gold, which substantially shows a good health of the international traffics. And instead, from between the 20s and the 40s of the 14th century, the tendency began to go the opposite way. So this caused really a lot of problems, especially in financial terms, because this is essentially the Europe of incipient humanism. So think also about art, about the financial investments in the construction of cathedrals, of great infrastructures, of all those things that had seen an increase in the last generations, that at this point kind of collapsed. The wealthiest cities in many ways did at the beginning of the 14th century something that might seem crazy to us, but that tells you how wealthy they were becoming in certain cases. That is, starting certain infrastructures like huge city walls or cathedrals, that essentially it wasn't matter whether they when they had to be finished, but the important was that it was you know an open building site, that essentially people could go there and receive money from people who had interest to form a clienteler system, etc. And as a result, in fact, is that when the crisis actually hit hard, all these infrastructures at a certain point were stopped being built, and this is the reasons why so many European cathedrals, for instance, that were something enormous, that is something still architecturally enormous today, were essentially stopped and in their construction, and sometimes they were finished in modern, if not even during the contemporary age, because they had been started at a time in which they were feasible theoretically in some times that could be even generations, but that were expected to finish at least at that point. Instead, no. Um, the huge crisis of the 14th century blocks that, and the fact that it took centuries sometimes to finish those structures tells you how, gives you really the dimension of how that crisis had hit hard. So and this obviously hit heavily the financial system. We can talk this time already of sort of proto-capitalism, although in my opinion it's already capitalism in many ways, where banks, loans, and even very big quantities and a very high level. And the fulcrum of European economy at the time was Florence, the Florentine banks, that especially the families of the Acciaioli, the Bardi, the Peruzzi, etc., who basically financed the whole Europe. I mean, all the wars like the Hundred Years' War, or all the major conflicts were essentially financed by these Italian bankers. And and one of the main problems with the economical crisis is that at a certain point the European monarchs that had taken these loans basically couldn't solve them anymore because there weren't money. It was a huge crisis. So the first thing that happened is that banks went failed, not unsurprisingly, and this in turn caused a lot of problems, just like today, because the middle and the medium and small businesses, especially the mercantile ones, to which the great banks had entrusted the management of their own capitals, basically failed in turn. So it was a sort of domino effect that saw the sale of many goods, also properties of land, of palaces, etc. And this, on the long run, produced also another phenomenon that I also find quite fascinating. That is, that this crisis basically increased the concentration of wealth into the hands of a very few people, while the rest of the population was greatly impoverished. This is very important because in a way it accelerated the process of um, even a restructuration of certain political entities. I mean, the lordships of certain national monarchies in a certain sense were strengthened by this. Maybe not immediately, but on the long run, what happened is that there were fewer people that during those decades of crisis managed to acquire illegally a huge quantity of property, increasing inequality and in a certain sense crystallizing the society of late medieval and even early modern world was a very idling one. It was medieval society between the 11th and the 14th century had been quite mobile in many ways. The crisis stops this social mobility, and this is how social stands of the ancien regime actually get well, neatly shaped in a way, and how even these affected political processes, so that there were certain stands, certain social classes that were more privileged in a way, that had more political power, more political prerogatives, so more wealth and more weight, in generally speaking, and more power, obviously. This, in a sense, dramatically changed the course of a European society that could theoretically take another path, because from one side we've seen that these economical financial stagnation that already existed before the Black Plague was tied to a general crisis already lying into the very deeper veins of the society of that time. But if there hadn't been this conjuncture of the Black Death and all these problems had maybe remained in a sort of stall, maybe with some recession here and some timid growth in there, possibly European history would have reached certain levels of education or scientific progress in different times that it's very difficult to really foresee. But in many ways, you see how the crisis of 14th century really wiped out a very lively and highly productive middle class that had been the protagonist of the rebirth of low medieval Europe, that could theoretically give more in terms of intellectual or scientifical research, because it would have increased competition. The crisis instead sort of caused a general there were a few rich people who were satisfied with their income and didn't even care much of increasing it, because they were already wealthy, so who cared? Instead, a society where wealth is better distributed is also a much more cynetic and competitive society that can at a general level give more results in terms of civilization, development and competition and application of intelligence and brilliance, etc. So that in many ways, when we talk about the Renaissance, and we think about all these great geniuses that were out there, but most of them were actually people who were paid by the courts, and that were definitely worthy, that point also because courts didn't like to waste money unnecessarily, of course. But if the great crisis of 14th century had not occurred, maybe together with those geniuses we would have had others that at that time maybe didn't have the favor of that prince or that sovereign, and they were not financed and basically produced no results. So this is also very important relatively to our world, because I think our world is really going towards that crisis. We have grown so much essentially since the first industrial revolution. We achieved mass society. We expanded so much economically in also in quality of life. It's exactly the same thing that happened in the low Middle Ages. And then now there's a crisis, and this crisis is subtle. You see that it's not that we're deeply going down. It's kind of we grew at a certain point, then it was sort of stall, then maybe a fall down a little bit, but it's just sort of an adjustment of a certain recessive phases, but it's a sort of stall. Well, this has strikingly similarities what happened in the 14th century, and I hope that no great pandemic will affect the world at this point. Obviously, we are in a much different world, even immunity speaking, we are better fed. We have, even though we are still quite much exposed to the risks of pandemics and stuff of viruses that can't be stopped so easily. But the point I wanted to make is related more to to a strictly social and economical one. That is, if there is a crisis or a stall or a recession, usually societies tend to stratify. And what you see in the West today is exactly this. We grew essentially as the middle classes grew enormously. In the second half of the 20th century, people could, for the first time, all afford a car, eventually a house, and all the technology that could be seen as a luxus in previous times. Well, we all grew rather homogeneously. Obviously, there was also imbalancements and inequalities in this process. But with what is happening now is that there is a style for which those who were growing do not have a base anymore. So those who were poorer are becoming poorer. Those who were middle class now are struggling and are slowly becoming poorer as well. Instead, the wealthier guys at the top are getting always wealthier, and you can't. And I'm not making an ideological position here. I'm not saying, you know, the rich guys are the bad guys. It's not me, because also because it would kind of backfire my situation. But I'm saying that these are economical processes that, just like in that day, we said that before, are not quite clearly understood, because in our mindset now that we're just, you know, stuck on iPhones and Facebook and jerking around, we don't even follow so much these economical processes. So we face the crisis, we know that it's out there, but just like those guys in 14th centuries, yeah, we acknowledge that there is a problem, it's evident, but we don't get the whole picture straight, either because we're not enough educated or because simply we don't care. But just for saying that, probably we will arrive quite soon, this is what I believe, to a sort of new social stratification that is already occurring, and that will bring, I don't know what it will bring, if it will bring to a new renaissance that happened in spite of social stratification back in the day. I don't know if this will bring to a new scientific revolution, or I don't know. We don't know. We don't know, because scientific revolution, by the way, had other premises that were kind of from the middle class. So it would be fascinating to know the future also in this sense. And however, I must say also that we don't have to stress similarities so much. It doesn't mean that something that happened in the past has to happen the same way. Never happens. Always remember that history never repeats itself. Never. So, but it's still interesting, because there are certain processes that are comparable, and it's useful also for historical research, because you know, understanding history is something very very difficult in many ways, and it takes a lot of time to spot all the differences with the past and to make comparisons, and but it still helps to understand our societies, and this is why we study history with a purpose, I believe. So I got a bit of carried away till the end. I'm not even sure I explained very much what I wanted to do. We didn't talk much about the crisis of 13, 15 and 17, but overall I hope the general picture was clear. How essentially the Black Death arrived in a situation that was already pretty much messed up in the first half of the 14th century in Europe. This happened also in Asia, by the way. In Asia, probably there were even worse problems, but I will talk about that in another video. So for now, I just thank you for listening to me, if you had the patience to arrive at this point. And as always, if you like this video, please share it, because it's a good way to, if you like my channel, if you like my contents, to receive more if you share. Or otherwise, you can just leave a like or subscribe if you just want to get straight to the source of my contents. And as always, I thank you for watching. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.